Hello and welcome to the Underhive. We are back with some more How to Command the Death Guard. In this series, we're going to take a look at every aspect of the Death Guard, so whether you're looking to get more out of your army, or you're thinking of joining Nurgle's dirty protest, then there's something here for you. In this episode, we're going to take a look at running Demons of Nurgle alongside the Death Guard. So, of course, one important rule to remember, that Demons cannot constitute more than 25% of your power level. Strangely, a given 2,000 point list is going to be around about 100 power level, give or take. So you roughly got about 25 power level to use on demons without losing access to your Death Guard rules, like your Contagions of Nurgle ability. So let's dive in and take a look at running some demons. Now, there's a valid reason to run any of the demons if you feel it complements your list or you just want to run them. That's as good a reason as any. Now, I've put these into my top 3, but it is somewhat arbitrary because it's just my personal preference. If you have got any suggestions for the units that you'd want to run or maybe have run in your Death Guard list to some success, I would be delighted to hear from you. So please do feel free to continue the discussion in the comments. Now, before we look at supporting an army with another army, so in this case the Nurgle Demons, it's important to understand what our army does and where the gaps in that game plan might be. For the Death Guard particularly, they've got great infantry options with mass obsec. So replacing your infantry options is potentially a detriment to you because you may be giving up an obsec unit for a unit that isn't. They also have great durability and predominantly a melee output. So the Death Guard will typically last long enough to get to that frontline engagement. Against a particularly shooting army, you may lose some of your units, of course, but if you position well, you can mitigate that to an extent. And of course, being predominantly melee, once you get there, you should be able to deal with whatever unit is in front of you, as long as you've accounted for a variety of profiles in your melee output. They've also got good access to mortal wounds, so whether that be from the ability of the Putrefier, I've since started putting a Putrefier in my list and I've had good success with the additional mortal wound output from him on the likes of the Death Shroud. But you've also got a variety of psychic powers and relics that will pump out some additional mortal wounds, as well as the deadly pathogens. So there's a variety of ways that you can get some mortal wound output in the list, rather than being forced down one particular angle. But as far as the weaknesses, they are slow in terms of their movement, outside of a few key choices like the bloat drone, which has been a very staple pick for me recently as a result. They are limited in their shooting output. Now, of course, you can kit out Blight Lords and Plague Marines for shooting, but Blight Lords, for me at the moment, feel like they play second string to the Death Shroud, and the Plague Marines have got massive melee potential if you take those melee upgrades. So that overall is going to leave you with fewer shooting units, maybe only a Blight Hauler unit or some Plague Burst Crawlers in the list. And of course, we are heavily reliant on wound rerolls. Now, sadly, that's not something that you're going to avoid entirely by picking a unit that doesn't rely on wound rerolls, because that simply means they haven't got the chance to benefit from them. But there are more and more armies now that will look to shut off wound rerolls, particularly Iron Warriors that just shut it out wholesale, and Leagues of Votann, which again are very strong and will likely see a good amount of competitive play. So having something to tech against needing those rerolls to get the job done isn't necessarily a bad thing. So in terms of the demon units that I would bring to support that, starting at number 3, we've got the Soul Grinder. And of course, this would be a Soul Grinder of Nurgle. So that's coming in at 10 power levels, so you could afford to slot a couple of these in if you wanted to, and they come in at 190 points. So not too expensive to slot into your list. It's a 16 wound model at toughness 9. So that is a lot to chew through, despite being a very large base and quite obvious to see from a variety of angles on a typical board. It is still a lot to get through. There are not that many weapons in the game that are going to be getting a good wound reroll against this guy. And of course, being a demon, they have the demon save with a 4-up at range. So again, they're likely to outlast the typical sort of shooting you would fire into this sort of unit, because predominantly that will be high AP weapons like, say, melters or las cannons that might otherwise put your units on 4-up invulns or worse than that in terms of saves. So the 4-up there against range, I think, is brilliant, even though it can't be any better than that. It does provide a good ranged output against a variety of targets, really. You've got the Phlegm Bombardment, which is comparable to the bombardment on a Plague Burst Crawler, but does need line of sight, but it is damage 3. So Strength 8, AP 2, damage 3. It's going to be good into some elite infantry, though you probably want to chip that first wound off if they've got Mark of Tzeentch on a Terminator squad. But being AP 2 means at least it's chipping off one of the pips of AP, even after Armour of Contempt. You've then also got the Harvester Cannon, so that is making 6 shots. It's only AP 1, so it is that bit weaker against Armour of Contempt, but otherwise still good, and it is flat damage too. So one of the weapons there, not too detrimental if it's into a unit with -1 damage, but of course that flat 2 damage weapon, you're going to be looking to maximise that and get that into something that can't reduce the damage. Luckily for us, Death Guard have the broadest access to that, so the opponent isn't likely to have too much access, other than if it's a heavily Dreadnought-inspired list, or if we're talking about a Death Guard mirror match. If it can get up close, it's got 5 attacks with the Iron Claws, or whatever they're called, at Strength 16, AP -3, and D6 damage. So that's going to be great getting into something like a Land Fortress if you can engage with it, but really into any big monster or vehicle. The D6 damage is swingy. Of course, you can roll badly on that occasionally, but if you've saved yourself a CP for the reroll on the damage, you may well be able to turn that around. But even so, averaging, say, 3 damage out of that is still a pretty good profile with those 5 attacks. And it's got a further 2 Malefic attacks with the sword, which is the way I would kit it out, at Strength 8, AP 3, and D3 plus 3 damage. And of course, that AP 3 being Malefic means that it can't be affected by Armour of Contempt. So that is a particularly good few attacks to put into those Terminators with the Mark of Tzeentch if you've already managed to chip a wound off them this phase to proc that. But either way around, that can be great into really anything high value that has that has good saves or otherwise a decent wound pool per model, because you've got the output there to potentially chew through a model each attack. It can go toe-to-toe with more expensive threats, but it is limited by bracketing. If your opponent can take it out with shooting early, or at least chip it down sufficiently enough to bracket it, hitting on those 5+s starts to be less and less likely to actually do anything. However, the damage is still decent enough that 1 or 2 of those attacks getting through in a phase is still a decent amount of output. And ultimately, if you can position it well enough, if we're talking about sort of like WTC style layouts where we've got some tall, perhaps obscuring ruins, wide enough to support that wide base being behind them, or all those crab legs being behind them, then you may be able to keep it from being shot at by the vast majority of the opponent's army early enough so that it can move up the board. And once it does get close range, of course, it is a vehicle. It's got that big guns never tire on those weapons there. I will say at least one of them is blast. Yeah, the bombardment is blast, so it's not going to be able to use that in melee, but at least the Harvester Cannon can still be used when it's in engagement range. But even so, having that big T9 is just a model that can tag up with a lot of units and potentially still outlast them. It does only have the 5-up in melee though, yeah, only a 5-up in melee. So if it does get in with something that has a lot of attack output, or if we're unable to shut off rerolls with the likes of Gloaming Bloat, it can be brought down fairly well with weight of fire. But that is, or rather weight of dice, whether it's shooting or melee, but that is true of the vast majority of demon units anyway, in one area or another, whether it be in melee or in shooting one way. So whilst that is still a weakness, it is a weakness of the demons as a whole, and it's not necessarily going to be that much worse a save than might be the case for any units you might run, even with Armour of Contempt, if we are talking about some high AP weapons. Does offer a very similar output to the Plague Burst Crawler, but for the additional cost, you're getting a solid melee profile. It isn't necessarily needed because having something shooting from the back line isn't necessarily a bad thing. Plenty of armies out there have the same game plan as the Death Guard, which is to get up in the opponent's face, and they wouldn't necessarily be able to pivot from that just because that's exactly what you want them to do. So being able to move that gun line forwards and have it put out some pressure in melee as well could be well worth it. So for me, if I was subbing in a Soul Grinder, it would probably slot best in a list that was already looking to run some sort of gun line from the likes of a Plague Burst Crawler. We maybe cut one of those and maybe shave off a model or two from some of the other units we have to make up those extra points. In second place for me would be the Beasts of Nurgle. Now, they can come in a squad of up to 3. So a squad of 3, which I think is the way to go for them, would be 12 power level and 240 points. So you could feasibly chuck a couple of these into a list if you wanted to. They have 7 wounds each at toughness 6, and with that 4-up demon save at range, going down to a 5-up in melee. Now, importantly, one of the probably the most important factors on these is combining that 7 wounds per model with the ability to regenerate to full health if a model is left below full health at the end of the phase. So your opponents used all of their shooting up, they've not been able to chip that final wound down, and it's going to immediately regenerate those full 7 wounds again at the end of their shooting phase. So even if they are then looking to make a charge, that chip damage meant absolutely nothing. And that is a massive rule in terms of the way an opponent needs to make decisions, which is why I'm ranking it at number 2. Now, ultimately, your opponent could dedicate the whole army's worth of shooting and wipe the squad. They're not immortal. Fair enough, they could be killed. But for 240 points, that could potentially save a squad or 2 of Death Shroud from losing several models that would otherwise have been an important threat to have as an OBSEC unit on a midpoint later in the game. It could save a squad of Plague Marines from taking some chip fire, and then they've actually still got their Blight Launchers and Melters available to shoot back and chip off some models of your opponent in return. They do also have decent movement at, I believe it's 6 inches base. Yeah, 6 inches base, so they're slightly faster than your Death Guard, and given that there's no shooting option on there, you're probably going to be advancing them early. So you are looking for those good advances to get some meaningful movement done, but even if they don't, they can stick out like a sore thumb, and I wouldn't be too bothered about exposing these guys and using them as that distraction carnifex to eat up the shots, unless I've been able to hide everything, in which case you would want to hide them as well, just to make your opponent's shooting phase essentially moot. Now, they also have a 6-inch heroic intervention, which again gives your opponent some tougher options. If they are charging into multiple units and these beasts of Nurgle are hanging around nearby, they could end up eating some attacks from the beasts as well. They have 6 attacks each, and although they're only hitting on a 4+, 3 attacks on average going through at strength 6, AP -2, and flat damage 2 is very nice. It's not a Malefic, unfortunately, so it is going to go down to AP 1 against Armour of Contempt, but that's still a great place to be. Putting typical Marines on a 4-up save means chances are they are losing a model to each of the beasts that gets in. When they all move towards an opponent's point scoring units, like their typical line troops, firstly, these guys have a good profile into most infantry, so they become a priority target that cannot just be chipped down over multiple turns, so that forces the opponent to commit heavily, leaving your point scoring unit alone. And although they are weak to the weight of dice output, that could be countered by having a Gloaming Bloat in the list that is protecting an area nearby the beasts, potentially stopping your opponent, particularly with melee weapons, like, say, a Chapter Mastered or similar ability, re-rolling weapons that otherwise have a -1. or something like Lightning Claws that has the heavy reroll wound access. Again, limiting that will give that extra toughness to the Beast of Nurgle, essentially by those attacks not necessarily converting, and as a result, they may not be able to cut down a model. And if you can orchestrate a position where your opponent doesn't fully kill a model, maybe has to spend a CP to try and re-roll something if they can, to try and push more attacks or more damage through, you are progressively limiting their resources available to deal with the rest of your army later in the game. And I think committing anywhere up to 400-500 points of units that you are willing to throw away is completely fine for Nephilim. And the Beast of Nurgle being able to take 2 squads of the full 3 and them not being terribly slow, they are pretty slow, but not being terribly slow because you are willing to advance them pretty much every turn that they can't charge, I think puts them in a really, really good position to support what Death Guard want to do, which is march up the OBSEC, control at least 3 objectives, and put a bit of pressure, make the opponent think about defending their own objectives so that you can pressure them out of the primary and hopefully score those additional points through spread the sickness is most likely, but also perhaps fleeing vectors throughout the game. And in there at my number 1 would be the Great Unclean one. Now, he's number 1 partly for that wow factor. I really love the model. I just think they're an awesome unit to have on the battlefield, but he does some really good stuff for the list as well. He comes in at 15 power level, so you're only going to be running one of these guys in your support, but you have got room to chuck in something else, like you could very possibly have a Soul Grinder in there as well if you wanted to. He comes in at 22 wounds, so he does not get obscuring, but again, at toughness 9, with that 4-up demon save at range, really just gives your opponent a great big target, and it's really going to soak up that firepower. Anything that's below strength 9 is going to have a hard time wounding, and then you're ignoring half of those on average, which should allow him to survive turn 1 against most armies, unless they are heavily centered around shooting. And realistically, weight of dice would be a big threat here, because whether we're talking about no AP 1 damage or we're talking about melter shots, on average he's ignoring half of them. So it's only going to take 44 to get through the wound roll to on average kill him if we're talking about single damage shots. If it does get into melee, there is some big attacks coming in there. You've got the Strength 8 AP 3 D6 damage with the Bile Sword. And it's 4 to 6 attacks with that, depending on the profile. So certainly can pump out the damage there into really any target, but ideally looking for something that's T8 down to T7 as a result of some Death Guard contagions. So it would be important to have something there supporting the Great Unclean one, just to make sure he can get that. But there is a way the Great Unclean one can do that for himself, and we'll come back to that in a minute. At short range, there's some great shooting profiles as well, and they are both assault, so there's no danger in terms of advancing the Great Unclean one, which is exactly what you're going to want to do with most Death Guard units turn 1 to really make up that distance as soon as possible, so that you can perhaps look to make a charge turn 2. The 2 shooting profiles are in there at AP3 and AP2. One of them is a flamer, so that's going to get the auto hits. The flail, that's going to be a roll you hit. So that is going to suffer a little from the advance, but it's still better to be able to shoot it than not. We've got, I believe it's 2 damage and 1 damage on that. Yeah, so we've got AP3 and 2 damage. So that's going to be good at taking out some mid-range infantry, like say typical Marines. And then we've got the Putrid Vomit, which is at the 12-inch rather than 7. That's the Assault D6 that auto hits. So it's a flamer with 2 AP at strength 5, which is pretty tasty for just dealing with light infantry or just taking an optimistic few shots here and there at anything in range. He is also a Psyker. Now, he comes with some nice buffs for core demons, but given what we mentioned earlier about the Death Guard having some great infantry choices, mass obsec, great durability, great melee output, I don't think I would necessarily want to swap them out for a unit of, you know, Nurgle demons to be able to get some buffs on them, because I still don't think they match the potency of the likes of some Plague Marines, or if you've got the extra points, some Death Shroud or even Blight Lords. So for me, I would be looking at Malodorous Paul, which is an enemy unit that is visible within 18, removes OBSEC from them, and they fail actions for that turn that they might be trying to complete. Of course, actions and OBSEC are a very important part of matched play, even as far as Tempest as well, if you're playing that. So removing OBSEC from a unit, of course, could allow you to just step one of your Plague Marines, one of your Death Shroud onto that objective and take it off the opponent. Could be relevant for a secondary, though perhaps less likely for the Death Guard. Could be relevant for the bonus on a primary, but ultimately it could just deny your opponent holding more or even holding 2 as part of their primary, and severely mitigate their ability to score on the primary, giving you that edge in your later turns. But even just stopping them failing an action can be enough, even if the OBSEC part doesn't matter. Just failing that action a turn, if we're talking about banners and it's an objective that you're not going to be able to get to it within the next few turns, firstly, that essentially stopped them shooting that turn, which could have been relevant, but it also kept them in that position, so they're not necessarily going to be able to do anything good the next turn because they're out of position now. And of course, it's stopping them scoring those recurring points if it is something like banners. And also for things like, say, Ultramarines, they have to hand over the turn. Same with Thousand Suns, they have to hand over the turn. So whilst they can score big if they see it through, having a unit like this on the board may make your opponent think twice about when they do try to march from a crag or do try to, whatever it's called, mess with reality as the Thousand Suns, because unlike the Death Guard, it doesn't complete in their own turn. And if this guy's going to be able to draw line of sight, it might just persuade them to not do it anyway and give the opportunity for this guy to just do a smite instead of taking them out with the Malodorous Paul. Now, it's also a good selection, in my opinion, to have the Shriveling Pox, which again requires a visible enemy unit within 18 inch of this Psyker, and it gives them -1 toughness. Now, of course, we already have access to a good amount of -1 toughness in terms of the Contagions of Nurgle, which wouldn't be shut off because we're only taking 25% of our power level as demons. But having that out of 18 inch for a visible is going to be very good if you do decide to run the likes of either the Plagueburst Crawlers or the Soul Grinders, because you're not likely to have that sort of range so early in a game. Being able to target something at 18 inch is great to have for your shooting. But on top of that, he could just double down and -2 toughness something that is in contagion range with this on top, and make, let's say it's a toughness 6, some kind of like Eldar Wraith unit. Toughness 6 goes down to toughness 5 for being in contagion, down to toughness 4 because of this spell, and now this guy's wounding them on 2s with his melee attacks. Would also be wounding them on 3s for both of the ranged attacks. So it can be used to great effect for manipulating his own profiles, but of course, minusing another toughness, if we're talking about big monsters, big vehicles, that is something the Plague Marines will enjoy as well, to be able to get those 3s to wound when they might have otherwise been 4 with some of those plague weapons. Now, of course, being a big model with no obscuring, he has got the downside of potentially being shot off the board early, and he doesn't have -1 damage, so those 2 damage weapons are going to find a home if you are running the demons, and that's one of the bigger reasons for me to feel that it's not necessarily a benefit. When I play my Death Guard into an army that's brought a lot of damage to weapons, of course, you always give a nod to your opponent, apologies that it is going to wreck those and make them a bit less valuable here, but ultimately that's one of the reasons that ability exists in the game, so that damage 2 isn't an unstoppable, auto pick that you would just take for every choice you can. So when you run up against that, giving your opponent targets that particularly are not obscured for those damage 2 weapons isn't necessarily where you would want to be, but I still think it is that cool to run a Greater Unclean one that I'd be willing to take that risk, and hopefully that 4-up demon save should shrug off the worst of it. He is relatively slow, but again, that's nothing new to us, and because he's got those assault weapons, he does warrant advancing for the first turn or two of the game. And again, having that distraction in the list for just 300 points, I don't think is that bad a thing. The likes of Mortarion isn't a model that you want to use as a distraction. He force multiplies so much of the army that having him where he needs to be and getting some melee output out of him is really the primary goal, and protecting him as much as possible is the primary goal if you have got some big pieces of terrain that can hide him entirely. But ultimately, when that's not the option, he does tend to get shot down. And given that we've got these you don't get an invuln profiles in the game, it does make him feel that bit weaker. So subbing the likes of Mortarion out for a Greater Unclean one, you will of course have to spend some CP to get those Warlord traits that support your army in the list if you still want them, but this guy pretty much does everything else. He can wreck, not quite as well as Mortarion in melee, but he actually does probably better than Mortarion at range, in my opinion. I think Lantern is in need of some serious buffing, given the likes of the Votann shooting and the lore surrounding the Lantern, but we'll save that for another video. But I think the Greater Unclean one slots very, very nicely into a list that's otherwise running Mortarion and fancies a bit of a change. You would have 150 points left over for that, so you could chuck in a couple of Beasts of Nurgle with relative ease, and that would keep you within your 25% limit for most 2,000 point lists, again being an average of roughly 100 power level. Well, that is my top 3 best demons to support your Death Guard. As I mentioned earlier on, if you've got any tips yourself, any suggestions for units that you feel would work well, please do continue the conversation in the comments. I will get back to you and add my opinion also. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time in the Underhive.